The fire had gone out. That was the first thing he noticed, crossing the yard in the dark, lantern swinging, boots raising small puffs of dust from the cracked earth. The fire should have been going at this hour. His wife always had the fire going. He called out her name. Nothing came back but the sound of something moving through the scrub near the waterhole. Some small creature going about its business in the dark. The Barcoo country was full of these sounds after sundown. 40 years of working outback Queensland, and he'd learned to read them all. He called out again. The door to the slab and bark hut was open. Not ajar, open, standing wide, the way he'd leave it if he'd gone out in a hurry. He stepped inside and he held his lantern up. And there she was, on the floor near the far wall. Knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't unconscious, her eyes were open. She was staring at something in the middle of the room that wasn't there. Her lips were moving but making no sound, and she was rocking gently, backwards and forwards. He crossed the room in 4 strides and knelt beside her and said her name again, close this time. And she turned to look at him as though she was surfacing from somewhere very deep. She tried to speak, but what came out were just sounds, not words. He got her to the chair and built the fire back up and sat with her through the night. By morning, she was stringing sentences together. They were disjointed, circling, always arriving back at the same place. The sounds had come from the waterhole, she kept saying. A shrieking, she said, over and over again. A wailing, she explained. Something that built from nothing and grew until it filled the whole night. Not one sound, many. Not an animal, nothing like any animal that she'd heard before. He tried to reassure her and told her it would have been a bird, some night bird carrying on out here in the dark, where sounds tended to play tricks. He'd heard strange things himself over the years, he told her. The bush had a way of amplifying, of distorting. He told her he was sure of it, and he almost believed it himself. Welcome to Struth, a podcast where we delve into the most perplexing mysteries Australia has ever produced. Today's episode is about a sound so far outside the range of anything its witnesses could explain that it drove experienced men out of their swags and into the dark. A sound that stripped the certainty from people who had spent lifetimes in the Australian outback and thought they knew every noise it could make. A sound that was heard independently across 6 decades. And then, without explanation, never heard again. This is a story of the Wilga Waterhole. I'm your storyteller, Mark, and today we're heading to the outer Barcoo, the vast flat river basin country of central western Queensland west of the Great Dividing Range. It's where the Barcoo River runs slow and brown through mulga and Mitchell grass. We're going to a permanent waterhole on a cattle station called Rutherford, about 20 kilometres from a small town called Isisford, approximately 120 kilometres southeast of Longreach. A place so remote that when a researcher drove there in 2004, it took him nearly 2 hours from the station's front gate to reach the site. It's a place where something happened for 60 years that nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. The Barcoo River drains one of the most inhospitable catchments on the continent. In dry season it barely moves, a chain of water holes strung along a riverbed of pale sand and blue-grey clay, connected by nothing but the memory of water. In flood, it can spread for kilometres across the flat, treeless plains, turning the red country briefly, impossibly green, before the heat takes it back. In the second half of the 19th century, pastoralists pushed sheep and cattle into this country along the same routes the explorers had mapped. The Koongarri people had occupied the Barcoo and Thompson River country across approximately 36,000 square kilometres of grassland, and they knew the land as only generations of careful knowledge can know a place. Where the water was, in even the driest years, which waterholes held water and which didn't. The Wilga held. That was the thing about it. In a river system that could run bone dry for years at a stretch, the Wilga waterhole was permanent. Its depth and the ring of dogwood and coolabah trees that sheltered it from the sun kept it going through droughts that emptied everything else. It was exactly the kind of place you'd build a camp near if you were moving stock through country that offered no other water. Exactly the kind of place a boundary rider would be sent, or a station hand would pitch a hut, which is precisely what happened sometime in the 1860s, or perhaps the 1870s, when the pastoral runs were being consolidated under the great land barons of the era. These were men assembling privately held empires that stretched across millions of acres of Western Queensland. Somewhere in that period, on one of the properties that would eventually become Rutherford Station, someone built a small slab and bark hut near the waterhole, and at some point after that, the stories began. The station hands who had been through the area started to ask each other a question whenever a new man came through. Did you hear the Wilga ghost? Hearing the Wilga ghost is exactly what happened to the wife in our opening scene. She'd been in the bush all her life. That detail appears in every account that mentions her. The newspaper articles from the 1940s, the folklore collections, the retellings that passed from one district to the next across the Western Downs. She was sensible, practical, not a woman given to fright, the kind of woman who could be left alone on a remote property for days at a time without complaint, because she'd grown up in country like this, and she knew its sounds and understood its rhythms. And this matters. It matters because of what happened to her the second time. The first time, as we mentioned, the husband arrived home late to find her pale and shaking, barely able to speak. He'd given her the bird explanation. She'd accepted it, because maybe he was right. It was possible, of course. The night does play tricks, even on people who know it well. And then he went away on station business again. 2 nights this time. When he rode back into the yard, he could see her through the window of the hut before he'd even dismounted. She was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface, like she was trying to hold the table down. And the way she was just sitting there told him everything he needed to know before he'd even opened the door. She was worse this time, so much worse. Not just shaken, but undone. She told him, in between fits of crying that he described as unlike anything he'd ever witnessed from her in 20 years, about 2 nights of sounds rising from the waterhole. Not 1 night, 2, beginning the same way each time. Silence. A few ordinary sounds from the dark, and then, growing out of that silence, something that kept growing, kept building, kept arriving in new registers and new volumes until the whole night felt like it was screaming. She told him she hadn't slept. She told him that before the first night was done, she had stopped trying to find explanations for what she was hearing, because there weren't any. He packed their belongings the next morning and they left the hut, never to return. But before they left the district entirely, he told some of his colleagues at the shearing shed what had happened. He told them what his wife had heard, and what state it had reduced her to, and what it had done to his own certainty about ordinary explanations. His colleagues heard him out. They had some questions, and they decided to find out for themselves. There were several of them. The accounts vary on exactly how many, but they had one thing in common. They were sceptical. These were men who'd been sleeping under the stars in outback Queensland for years. Men who knew every night sound the bush could produce. Men who were not, they assured each other, going to be frightened off by anything a waterhole could offer. They set up camp near the old hut as the sun went down. They had their swags and their billy and a campfire. They had each other, which meant they also had derision, that particular social armour of men who don't want to admit they're nervous. They stayed up late, past midnight, one account suggests. Long enough that they'd more than proved their steadiness, they thought. The only alarm the night produced was an old bull that bellowed somewhere out in the dark and made them all jump, and then laugh at themselves for jumping. See? Nothing to worry about. Just usual, just a bull in the dark and their own overactive imaginations. And one by one they settled into their swags and the fire burned down to coals. The night was still. In the accounts that survive, what happened next began at the edge of hearing. It was a distant sound, low enough that for a moment no one was quite sure it was there. And then it grew. Beachcomber, the Sunday Mail journalist who wrote about this in 1941, compiled testimony from witnesses who described it in this way. None of them heard the first wail, but in a few seconds, as the wailing increased in pitch, every man was out of his swag and onto his feet. What came to their astounded ears was yelling and wailing and screaming, as if made by innumerable persons, and of such a volume and such a nature that it could not have been uttered by any single animal or bird of the bush. Not even a pack or a flock of any animal that they'd ever heard. They were out of their swags before they'd made any conscious decision to move. That detail appears in the accounts too. There was no deliberation, no looking at each other, no reaching any conclusion. Their bodies just went. Swags left behind, coffee mugs overturned, everything abandoned in the dark. And they didn't stop until they were a long way from the waterhole. In the morning, they went back to collect their gear and didn't speak much about what they heard. But the word got around, as it does in country like that. And the word was, don't camp at the Wilga. However, not everyone took that advice. The thing about a legend is that it's an invitation for a certain type of person. The louder it gets, the more it seems to demand a rational counter. Somewhere in the district, the Longreach leader reported on this, sometime around 1942, there were two men who heard the shearers' accounts and arrived at a particular conclusion. They needed rifles. The reasoning was sound enough on its face. Whatever was out there at the Wilga, bird, animal, person playing tricks, person in distress, A rifle was the most appropriate response to uncertainty in the dark. They weren't going out there to be frightened. They were going out there to solve it. And they were going to sit by that waterhole with weapons in their hands and wait for the thing to announce itself. And then they were going to deal with it. They set out in the evening and got to the old hut site before dark and found their positions. The account doesn't specify exactly where, but they were close to the waterhole, close enough to see the water in the last light, the surface flat and dark beneath the canopy of coolabah trees. And they waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The night moved around them the way an outback night does, slowly, quietly, full of the small sounds that are indistinguishable from silence until you're really listening hard. They held their rifles and watched the water, and they waited. And then it came. The most dreadful screams, the Longreach leader's account says, not qualifying the description, not hedging it, just the most dreadful screams. What followed is almost farcical, except that farcical doesn't quite capture it, because both men were genuinely terrified. In the darkness and the chaos and the noise that kept building around them, they lost track of each other, lost track of where the sound was coming from, lost track of where the hut was and which direction was away from the waterhole and which direction led back toward the shed. They fired their rifles not at anything specific, at the dark, at the sound, at the thing they couldn't see and couldn't explain. They discharged their weapons into the night and, by what must be considered fortunate circumstance given the state they were in, they just managed to miss each other. Neither man was hit. Bullets flying just inches away from their heads. They ran. It took a while to sort themselves out in the dark and get their bearings and get themselves onto a track that led somewhere familiar. But eventually, sweating, breathless, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, they arrived back at the main shearing shed. The other men were woken by the noise of their return. They came out to find two of the district's most confident, most practical men standing in the lamplight, rifles discharged, unable to construct a coherent account of what had happened, unable to explain what they'd heard, what they'd seen, what they'd fired at, or how they'd end up firing in each other's direction. They were put to bed, and they never went back. After that, people stopped arguing about the Wilga waterhole. The two most sceptical men anyone in the district could have named had gone in armed and come home broken. What more was there to say? There's a habit of mine that's easy to fall into with stories like this, and it goes in two directions. One is to decide the whole thing is just mass hysteria. Rough men spooking each other in the dark, one frightened woman setting off a chain of amplified rumour that grew with each retelling until it was unrecognisable from the original. The other is to go the other way entirely and reach for the supernatural, because the supernatural is at least a category of explanation, even if it really explains nothing. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere more complicated, because we do know one thing. A man named S.W. Cleary, who had lived in the Isisford district for years and wrote a letter to the Narromine News around 1928, said this. He'd heard the sounds for himself, and he followed them. One night, he wrote, he tracked the noise to a large tree overhanging the river near Ruthven. The next morning he sent a man up to investigate. And in a hollow limb, high up in the tree, they found a nest. 4 young owls, not yet fledged, still blind, helpless, featherless, and presumably very hungry. The screaming woman bird. That's the folk name for the barking owl, and it earns every syllable of it. The barking owl is one of Australia's most widespread raptors, equally at home in the open dry woodland along a river system as anywhere else in the country. It has two calls. The first is the one that gives it its name, a loud double-noted bark, like a dog. The second is something else entirely. Ornithologists describe it as a wavering human-like scream. Not a sound that reminds you of a human scream, not a sound you might, at a stretch, mistake for a human scream in certain conditions. A sound that, by the documented testimony of people who have encountered it without prior warning, is indistinguishable from a woman screaming in agony. Across colonial Australia, barking owls were blamed for bunyip sightings, for ghost stories, for reports of women crying in the bush, for accounts of children lost and calling for help. The bird was common enough that experienced bushmen should have recognised it, and many did. But a nest of young birds calling together from inside a hollow tree overhanging a permanent waterhole, in the acoustic chamber created by steep clay banks and a dense canopy of coolabah and dogwood, that would be something different in character from a single owl calling across an open paddock. So the barking owl is the most probable explanation. Possible explanations for why the sound ceased around 1925 include displacement of the local bird population through land clearing, the felling of the nesting tree itself, or simply the natural disruption of a local breeding group. None of these can be confirmed. But what's harder to explain is this. Experienced bushmen, men who'd spent lifetimes in country where barking owls lived, said consistently that the sounds at Wilga could not have been made by any bird they knew. The volume, the multiplicity, the sense that the sound was coming from everywhere all at once, as if the waterhole itself were producing it. Let's fast forward to 2004. A man named Philip Shields loaded his son Matthew into a four-wheel drive in southern New South Wales and set out on a 4,000 kilometre road trip to find the Wilga waterhole. He was a registered nurse with a PhD and an interest in Australian folklore, and he'd been carrying around a copy of Bill Beattie's 1960 book, A Treasury of Australian Folk Tales and Traditions, for long enough that it felt like an obligation rather than a choice. The chapter called Here's a Queer Tale had gotten under his skin, but their trip did not begin well. On the day he was due to leave, lightning struck the wiring on his vehicle and burned it out. He spent 3 days repairing it, and then it happened again in Cunnamulla. He took this as a sign of something, though whether warning or coincidence he couldn't say, but pressed on regardless. After getting permission from the station owner at the time, a man named Grant McPherson, who was, Shields noted, an excellent fellow and a font of local knowledge, they drove to the site. It took nearly 2 hours from the station's front gate, the last 5 kilometres through flood-damaged country where the track had disappeared entirely, and they arrived just before dark. The Wilga Waterhole, Shields wrote, is a truly beautiful place. Even in drought, when the Barcoo itself had stopped flowing, the waterhole held its depth. Clear, permanent, sheltered beneath the ring of trees that had protected it for as long as anyone could remember. Yellow belly and fork-tail catfish move through the deeper water. A goanna that can reach 2.5 metres in length had eaten all the snakes. They set up camp and waited. The night was quiet. Crickets, the occasional call of a water bird. Shields admitted he wore earplugs, an admission that he delivered with a certain self-awareness. He heard nothing he could not account for, except for a sequence of tree branches cracking in the darkness, one after the other in what he described as quick succession. He could put no particular explanation to that. And in the morning, when he awoke, he walked north along the levee bank. He found the hut first, or what was left of it. The fire hearth was still standing. Some of the forked timber posts that had held up the small stockyard beside it were still upright. There was old horse gear laying scattered around the site. And there was a rubbish tip downhill toward the waterhole full of bottles. Some of them, he reckoned, dated to the turn of the century. Then he kept walking and he found the graves. Two of them, a short distance from the hut ruins, each outlined by hand-hewn wooden stakes, ancient and weathered, the wood grey and dry, holding firm through what had to be well over 100 years of outback sun and wet season floods. One circle of stakes was larger than the other, significantly larger. The station owners, he noted, were protective of those graves, worried about visitors disturbing them. He took photographs and was careful. Nobody knows who's buried there. There's no names, no markers beyond the wooden circles. Local legend says it's a mother and a child. One of the murder stories attached to the site involves a woman who killed her infant, whose remorseful spirit cries out over the water. But the murder stories are many and contradictory, and none of them has been verified against any court or police file that anyone's been able to locate. The Longreach leader reported a boundary rider who went mad and murdered his wife and daughter and hid them down a well. The Narromine News told of a shepherd named Wilfred, murdered and thrown into the waterhole in the 1860s. Yet another account involves a young Aboriginal boy sent to retrieve horses. He's found dead, remains scattered by wild pigs before anyone thought to look for him with urgency. In a place with this many murder stories, it's worth asking whether the stories accumulated around a genuine event that has since become untraceable. Colonial era violence, inadequately documented, now buried under decades of retelling. Or whether the stories are simply what legend always does, provide human explanation for things that frighten people to death. Whatever the case, the graves don't answer that question. They just sit there, ringed by weathered stakes, within sight of a waterhole that terrified a district for 60 years. And that is the final mystery of the Wilgore waterhole, and perhaps the strangest of all. The whaling just stopped. Somewhere around 1925, no account pins it more precisely than that. Reports of the sounds ceased. Not gradually, the way a river dries up or a story fades. They stopped. People who had been afraid to camp there for 30 years went past and heard nothing. The district moved on. The shearing sheds found other things to talk about. The question, "Did you hear the Wilga ghost?" stopped being asked because there was nothing to ask about. Bill Beattie, writing in 1947, could find no recent testimony. The accounts that he compiled were all historical, drawn from earlier decades, earlier men, earlier nights beside a waterhole that had apparently decided it was done with haunting. Nobody bothered to go out there and solve it. Nobody published a triumphant letter to the Longreach leader explaining the hollow tree or the new nesting site or the acoustic effect they'd discovered. Because the thing just stopped, which is, in its own way, the most unsettling part of the whole story. A sound that terrified so many people across 6 decades vanished without explanation. leaving behind nothing but 2 unmarked graves, the ruins of a hut nobody ever lived in again, and a waterhole that sits today on private property. Beautiful, still, permanent, and silent. So there's no answer to the Wilga waterhole. There are explanations that fit some of the evidence, and details that don't fit any explanation. And the consistent testimony of ordinary people who heard something in the dark that they could not account for and could not forget. The barking owl is probably right. Probably Struth. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Struth. It's great to have you here. For those of you who haven't followed or subscribed on the podcast platforms that you use, please do so. It makes a huge difference to me. While you're at it, go and follow us on whichever social media platform you use. We're on most of them. Just look up Struth Podcast. You'll find me there. Next time on Struth, we're heading to Wanda Beach. Look forward to seeing you then.